Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me through the mic as well, or just my overly loud voice? Louder. But can you hear me through the mic, or do I need to be really loud? You can hear me through the mic. Okay, good. I'm Steph Bertozzi. I'm the Dean of the Public Health School, and I'm very, very happy to see all of you here. Thank you for turning out. I know it's late in the day. This is an exciting opportunity, though. We get to hear two really exciting people talk to us about an issue that I'm sure is preoccupying to people all across the country, and not just those of us who are here in this room, and that's gun violence. So this is the first of several things. It's the first of the Dean Speaker Series for this academic year for the School of Public Health, and it's the first in a 6-part series that we are co-sponsoring with the Center for Human Rights and Eric Stover on gun violence, which makes me really happy that this is actually, I have to give Eric all the credit for the initiative. It's really terrific that we're able to focus on this issue in this year. And to kick this off, we've got two exceptional people who are actually responsible for co-leading the new UC Center for Violence Prevention Research, which is located at UC Davis. And we have Garen Wintemute, the director, and Magdalena Cerdá, who's the deputy director. And Jen Ahern will tell you a little bit more about them. The way we're going to do this tonight is they're going to speak for about half of the time that we have available, and then I'm going to transform into Oprah Winfrey and moderate a Q&A. And I'll tell you now that what I'm planning on doing, because we're live streaming this, I'm going to ask people to come down on that side of the auditorium and ask your questions from the front. I'm going to hand you the microphone, and that way we can get both the question and the answers on the live stream, and Matt will be playing cameraman. And because we're going to do that, I'd ask you to think about the questions that you'd like to ask during the talks, but the same thing for our live stream folks, because you're going to be able to, Matt, how are they going to be able to communicate? Is there a chat? So there's a chat on the live stream that you can type in your questions, and then Matt can relay them to us all. I already mentioned Eric and the Human Rights Center, who are co-sponsoring this, but I want to mention we have several other co-sponsors. Very importantly, we have Brian, I saw him earlier. Oh, he's standing right in front of me. It's hard to miss. So Brian Raymond from Kaiser Permanente. They have been sponsoring for now. This is the third year, is that right? Yes. Third year in which Kaiser has been sponsoring with the School of Journalism. David Tuller is sitting next to him. And a series on health that relates to journalism and public information. And we're very grateful to Kaiser. And this particular series is also co-sponsored by the Social Science Matrix and the Henderson Center for Social Justice, and I'm very grateful to all of them for the support. I also want to mention that we have here Jimmy Draper, who is, raise your hand, Jimmy, back there, who's one of the leaders, or the leader of the Student Coalition Against Gun Violence here at Berkeley. And so I'll encourage you in the question and answer to take the mic and say a few words as well. So I encourage you to all look for, I'm supposed to tell you what the next talk is. Yeah, the next talk in the gun violence series is titled Battle Lines, Who is Framing the Debate on Gun Violence? And it features George Lakoff, who will be here at the law school on the 25th of October, and we'll keep you posted on subsequent events. And I encourage you also to check the Public Health School website on other events in the Dean Speaker Series. And with that, I'll ask Jen Ahern, my colleague at the School of Public Health, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Steph. Hi, I'm Jen Ahern. I'm one of the faculty members in the School of Public Health. I will take a very brief moment to introduce our speakers because they made me promise not to take very long. Garen, as Steph said, is the director of the Violence Prevention Research Program at UC Davis. What's notable about his work is that he was studying gun violence through a long period when there was effectively zero funding for this work. So you might ask him how he managed to do that. And Magda does work on, the associate director of the center does work on violence and its intersection with substance use and mental health. I consider them both colleagues as well as friends, and they're both dynamic and exciting speakers, and I think we'll have a lot to learn from them today. Thank you very much.
Hi. So a minute to take care of the electronics, and I'll stall for time by recalling out loud that there was a time in firearm violence prevention when we would get a group of people together. There we go. We'd get 4 or 5 people together for a panel, and we'd be at a national medical or scientific meeting, and we'd give good talks, and that panel of 4 or 5 people would outnumber the audience. Not anymore, and thank you for coming. It used to be hard to sell the idea that violence, firearm violence, was a health problem. The best and most succinct statement of the case I ever heard came from David Satcher shortly after he took over as head of CDC about 25 years ago now, who said, look, if violence isn't a health problem, why are all these people dying from it? So we're going to talk about all those people. By the way, may I ask, how many lawyers are going to be lawyers in the room, please? I like it. How many doctors are going to be doctors? How many public health are going to be public health? Perfect. This is the team. What you see up front today is not nearly as important as what you all do together. Make teams and make change, okay? The reason I brought that up is my talk is not going to be quantitatively intense, but there are going to be graphs, there are going to be numbers, we're going to move very quickly, and there are going to be tests. Let's start here before we get to the numbers. Let's start with mass shootings. A big reason there is such an intense continuing conversation about firearm violence in the United States. They're different, aren't they? Here, I have a theory about this. I think this is part of why. Public mass shootings, first off, are quite rare events. They account for less than 1% of all fatalities from firearm violence in the United States. Public mass shootings are the form of violence that we can't write ourselves out of, if you will. Homicide happens to people who don't have my demographic group. They're not my social group. They happen in places I know not to go to. I can write myself out of the story. Suicide, we don't talk about. There's no story. You don't even have to write. But these are different. Mass public shootings don't happen to people who aren't like me. They happen to people just like me. They don't happen in the places I know not to go to. They happen in places like the places I go to, maybe in the places I've been. Can't write ourselves out of the story, and that's one of the reasons that the conversation continues at the level it has for the last going on 4 years now. But let me quantify just a little bit. Test hasn't come yet. Take San Bernardino and Orlando and Sandy Hook and Aurora before that. 102 people died. Without minimizing those 102 tragedies at all, it's important to keep in mind that we lose more than 90 civilians to firearm violence a day in the United States, day in and day out. And from here on, I'm going to focus on that problem. Let's talk about all those people. I'm not going to repeat these numbers. You can see them faster than I can say them. I will add, as you're reading, some comparisons. I'm an epidemiologist, just enough to get into trouble. Here's a comparison. In the last 10 years for which we have data, or frankly any 10-year period you choose prior to that, in recent years, we have lost more civilians to firearm violence in the United States than we had combat casualties in World War II. We have lost more civilians to firearm violence in the last 10 years than we had combat casualties in all conflicts other than World War II in the nation's entire history from the Revolution to today combined. And it all adds up to real money. All right, test number one. How many people think that rates of firearm violence are increasing? By the way, you can't not vote. We're watching, it's being recorded. Come on. How many think they're going up? Good. How many think they're going down? 50-50. It's a trick question. They're not changing. I love this one. All right. Time is short. In the last 15 years, if you consider suicide and homicide together, and it is all violent, there has been no net change in firearm violence mortality rates in the United States. We have made, on balance, 0% progress. I could give you a whole lecture about what happened here and why these lines actually probably have crossed now. We don't have more recent data, but time is short. You can ask me about cars later if you want. Okay, test number 2. How many people think that most fatalities from firearm violence result from criminal activity? They're homicides. Most people think most firearm deaths are homicides. Oh, come on. Nobody? A few? How many think most of them are suicides? Pretty savvy audience. You're right. Most of them are suicides. But it's worth pointing out this. A couple of things here. So this is suicide. This is homicide. Even in the late 80s and early 90s, excuse me, when rates of firearm homicide went through the roof, and we're not sure why, and then came back down again, and we're not sure about that either because nobody was doing research to figure it out. Nobody had funding. Even then, suicide outnumbered firearm homicide. At the federal level, this is not true in California, nationwide, suicide, firearm suicide outnumbers firearm homicide 2 to 1. What's more, look at the trend. Homicide actually has been going down, although I expect 2015, 2016, when the numbers are in, are going to tick that line up. But look at suicide. We're going to spend a minute talking about those two things separately. We're actually going to spend about 5 minutes. Okay, tests are over. You can all go to sleep now. All right. We're looking now at homicide. We're looking at men. I have the graphs for women if anybody wants to know for Q&A. This is the picture you know even if you've never seen it before, right? This is firearm violence is a problem for young men of color, and I don't mean to demean it by using that tone of voice. It's just we've heard it, and it's true. It's not the whole story. Look at this. There are very few. I personally have not found one. I'm told I might have missed one or two. There are very few problems in medicine and public health where risk is so concentrated as it is here. And as somebody who doesn't just do research but also does policy development and policy work, I will tell you this really matters because the people at greatest risk can be put at socio-demographic distance by the people who are making policy decisions. And anybody who thinks that's not relevant needs to go back to school. You're in school. Just stay here longer. Okay, that's homicide, right? You've seen it. This is suicide. Same age categories, same axis, the numbers aren't as high, same overall display. These lines are less familiar, are they not? Here what we see is increases across the board, but this time the increases are greater for white men than for African American or Hispanic men. This is, let's call this level for the sake of time. This goes up and then it goes up more sharply. A less understood phenomenon. Let's put them together. We're looking here at violence. This is homicide and suicide put together. 89% of deaths from firearm violence among African American men are homicides. That's the homicide curve plus a little bit. 89% of firearm deaths among white men are suicides. That's the suicide curve plus a little bit, okay? Now, notice how flat it is. This line is basically that line. It's just that this peak is so pronounced. Look at the scale that when we put them together, this line gets flattened out. Is everybody with me? Okay. The public health people in the room know that I am taking here a traditional public health approach to this problem. We've been talking about risk the whole time. Who's at greatest risk? And without going into it, it's a model that makes a lot of sense. It is a helpful way to focus prevention resources, etc. But it's not the only approach. My last data slide is going to take the complementary population health approach. The population health approach stems from this sort of observation. The greatest number of deaths or adverse health events of any particular type can occur among people who are at low risk for those events, low risk, if the low risk population is large enough. I'm an ER doc. I work clinically. I have learned, because it's happening even more dramatically than in the past, most heart attacks occur among people who don't have lots of traditional risk factors for heart attacks. And increasingly, they're female, they're younger, they're et cetera. It's just that that population is larger. Risk is low, burden is high. Everybody with me? Okay, so last slide, more or less. All I'm going to do is shift from risk to burden. And mathematically, all I'm going to do is get rid of the denominator. And we're going to look not at deaths per 100,000 population risk. We're going to look just at number of deaths. But the number of deaths in this slide and the slide that follows is exactly the same. Okay? So, risk, burden. Suddenly, blue line a little bit easier to see. Risk is not higher. There are just lots of these people. Risk, burden. Risk, burden. I can do it all day. Who knew that gun violence was such an old white guy problem? All right, I'm done. I'm going to leave that up there just for a moment. Grab our website. It's a work in progress. It's a little awkward right now on our website, but it'll get better. And Magda's going to come up.
All right. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to follow up Garen's talk by presenting some numbers on the... Okay, 1 second. Just... Okay, try again. So I'm going to be following up Garen's talk by presenting some numbers on the global problem of firearm violence, and then also going ahead to talk a little bit about what we know about the links between gun availability and violence, what we know about the risk factors for violence, and what we know about interventions, suggesting some ways forward in terms of research. Okay, so Garen just talked about the burden of this problem in the United States. It's a problem not only in the United States, but in many countries across the world. It's estimated, in fact, that 500,000 people die each year from firearm violence across the world. This results in, and then that's just the tip of the iceberg. For every one death from firearm violence, there's approximately 4 more people who end up in the hospital. As it's the fact for the United States, it's also, this poses great social and economic costs all over the world. For example, it's been estimated that about $1 trillion could have been saved had we been able to reduce the global homicide rate in half. You can imagine that given the number of lives lost, the number of the great economic and social cost that this incurs, there's a great call for research on this topic now more recently, and for legislation and ways to respond to this problem. Before going any further, I just wanted to show you some numbers. What does violence look like worldwide? These are homicide rates, both firearm and non-related, across the world. What you see here are the countries that are darker are countries where there are higher homicide rates. And the disparities are pretty striking. So the highest homicide rates are concentrated in Central America. For example, Honduras, a rate of 90 per 100,000. Homicide, Caribbean, Jamaica, a huge problem. And Northern South America, particularly Venezuela and Colombia. So compare those numbers, right, to, and South Africa as well. a little bit less, but still. It's likely that there are a lot of countries in Africa that also have a high homicide rate, but that we don't have the data yet to be able to characterize it well. So compare those numbers to the US, where it's 3.8 per 100,000, and actually to a country in Europe, the UK, where it's 1 per 100,000. You see the numbers are quite strikingly different in the problem of violence overall. Okay, so then how does firearm violence play into this picture? Well, it follows the same pattern. So this is a graph showing you in the bottom the 4 different countries, for different regions across the world, the percentage of firearm-related homicides, and then the red line shows you the firearm homicide rate. And so what do we find? Those regions, those sub-regions with the greatest problems of homicide are indeed the places where there's the greatest proportion of homicides committed with firearms, right? So it's Central America, the Caribbean, South America, Southern Africa. Those are the places where there's a huge problem with firearm violence. It's also the places where we see the greatest overall. Okay, so we've shown you some numbers about the spread of the problem, the burden from this problem, both in the US and worldwide. What do we know? Beyond figures, what do we know about firearm violence? Well, what we know is strikingly little given the burden of the problem. I thought I'd put this graph, which was a study done by et al., published in JAMA in 2013, where he looked at the publications about the 10 leading causes of death for kids under 18 years of age. And so he compared, in the y-axis, there's the number of publications in the log scale for each of the 10 leading causes of death. And then in the x-axis, there's year of publication. Okay? So what you see here is that, is this the top line is neoplasms. And where is firearms? Can anybody see where firearms is? Anybody volunteer? Where's firearms? What's the position of firearms? The bottom, right. And so you may say, well, that's because there's a lot more deaths to neoplasms than there are to firearms among kids, right? Well, actually, no. There's approximately the same burden from neoplasms as from deaths related to firearms among kids, and yet there's been approximately 25 to 66 publications per year on firearm-related causes of death among kids, and between 5,500 on neoplasms. So about 13% of deaths accounted for by firearms, less than 0.3% of publications about firearms. Great disparity in terms between the burden of the problem, how much research we're investing in understanding this problem and figuring out how to prevent it. Okay, another question that comes up, and you may have seen a lot of debate about this in media and maybe amongst friends, is does having more guns, especially does having more guns in the home, actually necessarily lead to more violence? It might be that more guns in the home lead to violence, but it might be that actually people who have more guns, they're actually also likely to be more violent due to factors, right? Or it might be that guns in the home are protected and they're not going to increase your risk for violence. So this is an important question that needs to be answered. And there's been a consistent documented relationship between gun availability and firearm violence. So studies done at the national level, at the state level, at the local level, finding a relationship between firearm availability, number of guns, and higher rates of firearm homicide and firearm suicide. More specifically, focusing on guns in the home, there have also been studies finding that more guns in the home is related to higher risk of firearm violence. However, again, this question arises. Okay, this could all be due to another alternative third factor that causes both having more guns and more violence. So the question is, does having more guns in the home actually lead to violence? So I wanted to highlight a really interesting study that came out very recently in epidemiologic reviews that tried to get at this question. This is a study done by Matt Miller, who's currently at Northeastern. And so he did a review of the literature on the relationship between guns in the home and the risk of firearm suicide. He found, again, going back to the issue of the data on the topic of firearm violence, he found 4 case control studies that met his inclusion criteria. And what he wanted to ask is, could there be an unmeasured third factor that explains the relationship that we keep seeing between more guns in the home, more risk for firearm suicide? So he did what's called a bias analysis, where he looked at the prevalence that this unmeasured third factor would have to have, relationship that this third factor would have to have with number of guns in the home, and the relationship that this factor would have to have with firearm suicide. And so what he found, which was very interesting, is that for this unmeasured third factor to explain the relationship between number of guns in the home and firearm suicide, it would have as strongly related to suicide as the strongest risk factors for suicide, such as depression. But it would also have to be far more imbalanced across homes with and without guns than any known risk factors. So the possibility that there is such an unmeasured third factor that's explaining away the whole relationship between more guns in the home and firearm suicide is really vanishingly small. I think pretty good evidence that there is a strong and robust relationship between more guns in the home, higher for firearm suicide. Okay, so another question that comes up with firearm violence, as with any kind of public health topic that we may study, is what increases the risk for firearm violence? And as you can imagine, as with any kind of complex health topic, factors at multiple levels that can increase the risk for violence, from characteristics of the individual to characteristics of societies. Given the interest of brevity here, and we can talk more about other risk factors in Q&A, I'm just going to focus on one type of risk factor, which has received a fair amount of attention, which is substance abuse. That is, abuse of alcohol and other drugs. So you can imagine that the idea is that the psychopharmacological effects of drugs can alter people's thinking, it can alter people's decision-making skills, impulse control, and contribute, and then people may be at greater risk for either victims or perpetrating violence when they are acutely intoxicated. And indeed, there's been a consistent link found between abuse and firearm violence. In some of these cases, the associations have been explained by mostly other psychiatric risk factors that tend to co-occur with substance abuse and firearm violence, but there does seem to be a pretty solid link between substance abuse and the risk for firearm-related suicide, independent of other co-occurring psychiatric problems. But I think a broader and important question that we may want to ask as policy researchers, as public health people, is, do we really need to identify a causal effect between substance abuse and firearm violence? Or may we actually think about, even if substance abuse doesn't cause violence, we may still actually think about substance abuse as a very important risk marker for firearm violence. Think about, for example, that about a third of firearm homicide perpetrators and about a quarter of firearm suicide perpetrators were acutely intoxicated at the time of the event. That gives you a clue that perhaps looking at problems of substance abuse might be an important risk factor for vulnerability to firearm violence. And so going broader than that, there's a need for research to look at the impact that particular disqualification criteria from purchasing and owning guns based on a history of abuse, based on a history of alcohol abuse, could have on population rates of firearm homicide and firearm suicide. Okay, so then if we go beyond the magnitude of the problem, beyond whether more guns mean more violence and what risk factors may increase the risk for violence, something that we always want to know, and I imagine the question comes up again and again, is what can we do about firearm violence? So a fair amount of the research that has focused on firearm violence has focused on violence. There was a review that we conducted recently of the global literature on this problem. We reviewed 130 studies over 10 countries, and we found some pretty interesting findings. One of them was that there seems to be a particularly strong effect in places where multiple laws restricting the manufacture, access, and possession to guns happen at the same time. That is, in places like Australia, Austria, Brazil, they decided to create a whole program of policies addressing different aspects of firearm usage, manufacture, and purchase. And those kinds of multi-component policies seem to have an important effect in terms of reducing firearm suicide and homicide, suggesting that perhaps multi-component approaches have synergistic effects of reducing the problem of firearm violence. Beyond the implementation of multiple laws, also some evidence that laws restricting the purchase of guns, particularly background checks, and laws regulating the access to guns, particularly laws related to safe storage, may have an impact on violence and may have an impact on unintentional injuries to kids from firearms. Another area of research related to interventions has focused on the issue of safe storage of firearms. So beyond the laws restricting access and use of firearms, there's also an area of research where people try to design interventions to promote safe storage of guns among gun owners. And interestingly, what those studies have found is that the provision of a free storage device is critical. That is, you can't just, convince people or do a program to convince people that safe storage is important. You actually have to give them a device to use to store their guns. But there's a lot more research that we need to do about the impact that interventions in cities, interventions in communities can have on firearm violence. So related to that, where are we going? So right now, there's a lot more research that is happening in the recent years on firearm violence, and there's a real focus on intervention. Talking a little bit about what we're doing here, one of the areas that we're working on is the evaluation of existing policies, and the work that Garen is mostly leading, so particularly looking at comprehensive background checks and evaluating a program that is underway in California to remove guns from people who have been previously prohibited from owning guns. So you may want to ask about that in Q&A. We're also doing work trying to simulate targets for future interventions. That is, going beyond evaluating what actually exists based on simulations, what could be promising targets for future policies at the city and state level. And I can talk more about that in Q&A as well. So based on what I've told you, what we know, where we're going, what are we still missing? Well, you saw the numbers about the amount of research that has happened on this topic so far. Obviously, we need a lot more, right? And we're missing a lot. But some areas that I would say is one of the real areas of need is we need prospective studies that look at the causes and the consequences of violence. Studies that actually follow people over time and figure out what causes people to engage in violence, what causes people to be greater risk for victims of what are the long-standing, long-term consequences of violence, both in terms of health and social and economic outcomes. And I would argue that there's a particular need to focus on research on suicide. Garen showed you the numbers for suicide, and yet we know very little about what the causes of firearm suicide. Another area that I think is ripe for research is this idea of the social nature of firearm violence. That is, how does firearm violence or the idea of firearm violence spread through social networks? We're in an area where we have very little data, and it could help us identify points of intervention to prevent future firearm violence. And finally, I would argue that we really need to where the burden is highest. So I showed you some of the numbers of the rates of firearm violence around the world. I think we need to take those numbers seriously and invest in research to understand why there is such a problem of firearm violence in certain regions of the world and what we can do to prevent it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Can everybody hear me? No. Okay, my name is Brent Green, a graduate from the School of Public Health. Two questions, if they're allowed. One is, what solutions does the UK offer? Because you mentioned Austria and Australia, but you didn't mention UK that has such a low rate of firearms violence. And the other one is, I wonder if you could address the NRA's argument that if there's any kind of legislation, that it's a slippery slope. That, oh my goodness, those crazy radicals from Berkeley are going to eliminate all guns. And that seems to always be their argument, is this slippery slope. So I wonder if you could address that. Thank you.
The UK, and I'll take
Sure.
the slope.
Yes, so for the UK, thank you. That's a very interesting question. In our review of studies looking at different policies, we didn't find a particular study that explained the lower rates in the UK, but I think that's actually an area where we need to be studying. That is, we need more multinational studies trying to figure out what factors differentiate places like the UK from places like the US. And there have been some comparative studies done by firearm researchers in the US, but I think a lot more needs to be done on that.
And on the slippery slope, the easy answer is it's just not true. The NRA needs to raise money. It needs to keep its membership engaged, and the way you do that is by crying that the sky is falling all the time and creating straw man opponents. There are very, very few people who endorse the sort of policies. Now, I'm not a Berkeley radical, and I'm not going to speak for y'all. But where I come from and in most of the country, there's very, very little support for, let's say, a ban on handguns. What there is very broad support for, excuse me, is for measures like requiring a background check for all purchases of firearms. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through that. Let me just say this. 40% of all firearms transfers in the United States are directly between private parties. No dealer is involved. If a dealer is involved, background check, waiting period, paperwork, a permanent record. If it's a private party sale, none of those things apply. I have witnessed and photographed hundreds of those transactions. They're legal if the buyer is not a prohibited person. If he is, how are you going to find out? You have to ask, and everybody knows you don't ask the questions. People understand this. 90% of the general population supports requiring a background check for all purchases of firearms. But so do 80% of firearm owners and 70% of NRA members. The organization doesn't even represent the interests of its own membership.
I'm Chris Madsen. I'm faculty in the School of Public Health. Hi to the camera. So this is actually, that's exactly where I was going. And this is one of many public health problems that I think we have this tremendous disalignment where there's a public health agenda, a population health agenda, where there's an obvious approach that would improve population health, and then we have an economic agenda somewhere else where someone's profit is actually sort of at odds with the health of the public. And so my question for you is, are we ever going to see meaningful change as long as we have things like Citizens United, where the NRA can actually contribute to political campaigns? And what are your thoughts about the economics?
So the one word answer to your question is yes. Yes, I think we're going to see change. To be honest, I think we're going to see it fairly soon, and we'll see what happens in November. As Steph mentioned in the intro, I've been doing this for 35 years, and I have never seen anything remotely approaching the sustained level of intolerance for the situation as it now stands that I see now. This meeting is one of a great number of examples. Somebody might ask about research and the vested interest problem. 25 years ago, it became clear to people who had an economic interest in continuing to make firearms available and ammunition and so on, that research was underway that might serve as substrate for policy change that might threaten those interests. So those interests made the entirely logical decision to do what they could do to choke off the production of the research. It was brilliant. It worked. Now, the question I have now, 20-some years later, is how many thousands of people have died because the research wasn't done. We don't have the answers to questions we could have answered back then, etc. But about the future, I'm actually very optimistic.
I'm going to take the prerogative of sneaking one in before our next questioner. You mentioned at the beginning that we don't hear about 90 homicides a day, but we do hear about mass shootings. There's another thing we've heard about a lot over the last year, and that's police-mediated gun violence, where my understanding of the statistics suggests that we're just as far off the chart compared to our socioeconomic peers as countries as we are in the totals. And I'd be very curious how you think that's changing the national discourse about guns and why you think we're so much more violent, even though we're even violent with respect to other countries where police carry guns, not just to countries where police don't carry guns, and why is that?
Yep. So we're going to tag team this one. I'm going to start. Didn't bring it up just for lack of time, and thanks for the question. Added to everything you just said, one of the things we've just learned is we don't even have an accurate count on the number of these events. There's a new study by Deb Azrael and Matt Miller and colleagues looking at data from the National Violent Death Reporting System that suggests the case count that we get if you look at CDC's Whiskers database is just way off. This becomes one more area about which we don't know nearly enough in a systematic way. What we are seeing on the individual case basis is teaching us things that many of us, I think, would prefer not to be learning, and not just about police violence either, but about systemic racism and other kinds of bigotry in the United States. This one is just getting started. I do want to say this. I work with cops all the time, and this is just personal now. It has been very difficult for me to reconcile what I see in the videos with what I see in my colleagues, where great effort is taken. I see this in the emergency department. I see it when I'm out about that gun recovery program that Magda alluded to. Every effort is taken to mitigate the possibility of violence. I'll quantify that, and then I will stop and pass it to you. That program that Magda mentioned that we are evaluating, it's randomized trials, statewide randomized trial. More than 10,000 armed people have been intervened with by police, and their guns have been taken back. Not only has not a shot been fired, there's been no injury in 10,000 cases. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Yeah, I think the issue of police violence is a real challenge, and it's a real challenge for us as researchers as well, because we don't have the data. I do some research on policing and the impact of policing in terms of preventing violence, particularly community policing. And one of the things I get asked again and again is, but how are you accounting for violence committed by the police? And we can't. The answer is we can't, because we don't have the data. The data that we have says the amount of violence committed by police is actually quite tiny. It's a quite tiny proportion of the problem. But then again, what's the quality of that data? It seems probably not very good. So from a research perspective, trying to inform on that problem and trying to inform on what the role of police violence is within the broader scope of the concept of policing and how policing can prevent violence is a real challenge right now, given the lack of data.
Come forward so that he can see you.
Good evening. My name is Frank Snitz. I'm a resident of Berkeley, a retired environmental chemist, and I was enrolled in the School of Public Health at the University of Michigan. And my question concerns the proscribed research in the statutes that were sponsored by the NRA and the Congress so readily passed, and whether the research we've been hearing about skirts those laws or breaks them.
I'll take this one. So it neither skirts nor breaks. But that's just the beginning. There's never been a ban on research. Here is what happened. I lived this. Our research program was essentially shut down when this happened. Substrate, etc., that story. Congressman Jay Dickey, who described himself, his words, not mine, as the point man for the NRA, caused to be added to CDC's annual budget language, annual budget appropriation, the language that none of the funds could be used, direct quote, to advocate or promote gun control. The word research is not there. What Congress did when it adopted that language was remove from CDC's budget the $2.5 million, a sum equivalent to what it was giving for such research, and gave it back to CDC earmarked for traumatic brain injury, which was something else. We basically had to shut our program down. We kept it alive in part. Other people did shut their programs down. People left the field and went elsewhere. We don't have their work to benefit from because they went elsewhere. But it never said you can't do research. So, and many of us made that argument to no avail. In January 2013, President Obama at the White House, big megaphone, said research is not advocacy. He directed CDC to begin research, and he asked Congress for $10 million to fund the effort. He's still asking Congress for the money. He's also still asking CDC to start doing research. On its own, CDC has not taken that up. Although it's subject to the same language, the National Institutes of Health has, for the first time in its history, launched funding for research on firearm violence. And they're not hiding anything. Firearm violence is in the title of the solicitation. And thank you, because it's reminded me to announce that they reissued that announcement last week. Get on it. Proposals are due in October. So the NIH has stepped up. The CDC has its own problem. The National Institute of Justice, NIH for criminal justice, much smaller, had a program all along. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic, where'd she go, is all kinds of private sector funders are stepping up now. Not just individual foundations, but consortia of foundations are stepping up basically to say, we have a lot of money, tell us how to spend it. It's been a long time since I heard that.
Thank you, Dean Bertozzi, and hello, panelists. My regard to asking the question, my name is Joe, School of Public Health future student, I hope. So my question is about policy. We've been hearing throughout this campaign and in previous years, let's let the states figure it out. How would that look like in evaluating interventions and policy? And what states have done so, and who has the most strictest gun laws?
I would say that one of the states that has the strictest gun laws is where you're standing right now, California. I think the issue of the fact that states have the mandate to decide upon by themselves is in a way, speaking off of research, is a dangerous precedent, because it means that there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? There's states like California at the same time that there are states where kids can carry guns in the university. So there's a great heterogeneity, and you can imagine what the consequences of that could be in terms of lives. However, in terms of research, the fact that there is such variation across states does also offer opportunities to do research, because if you're interested in, for example, looking at the effect that comprehensive background checks have on firearm homicide, right? There are states that have comprehensive background checks. There are states that do not. So you can imagine that you can compare states with and without comprehensive background checks. You can get states that look similar to each other and look both before and after the enactment of comprehensive background check measure, or before and after the repeal of such a measure, and see what the impact is on firearm homicide or suicide.
Hello, panelists. Can you hear me? Hello, panelists. My name is Anitra, and I'm from the School of Public Health. And my question is about the effectiveness of buyback programs. And if buyback programs coupled with, let's say, Prop 63, if it is to pass in November, do you think that that would be an effective strategy to combat gun violence plaguing communities?
Got it. So let me take Prop 63 first. By the way, vote. Prop 63 would do a lot of things. It would establish a regulatory structure for the purchase of ammunition. It would establish a ban on the possession of ammunition magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. It would require reporting of firearms that have been stolen. It would, if fully enforced, actually largely supplant the program that we are evaluating and require judges, when a person is convicted of an offense that prohibits them from continuing to possess firearms, it would require judges to see if they possess firearms, and if so, not only order them to surrender those firearms, but put law enforcement on the case so it actually happens. Some of the things that are in Prop 63 have already been enacted by the legislature and signed by the governor. Gavin Newsom, who owns Prop 63, and Kevin De Leon, who is President Pro Tem of the Senate, and who had kind of occupied this space for a while, and who had legislation very similar to Prop 63 vetoed by the governor a couple of years ago, are kind of at it like this. So De Leon's legislation was reintroduced, and this time signed by the governor, but now there's this proposition hanging out there. There are mechanisms in place, should the proposition pass, that will reconcile the differences. As you're looking at the proposition, don't worry about that. And some of what it proposes to do intuitively would make a difference. Intuition is not a very good guide in this area, and I can't wait to do the evaluation of the magazine ban, whether it's the legislative one or Prop 63. Buybacks. I've done some research on buybacks. And I remain a skeptic if the outcome measure for a buyback is to reduce rates of violence in the community where the buyback occurs, for a bunch of reasons. The guns that are retrieved are never more than a very small fraction of the guns in that community. In the old days, they were also old broken guns. Everybody got it. Don't bring in your good stuff. Bring in the cruddy old guns and get some money, and sometimes even buy new guns with them. But the larger point was it in no way reduced the prevalence of firearms in the community. We actually did some survey research and found that more specifically, it almost never converted a gun-owning household to a non-gun owning household. Maybe we went from 5 guns to 4 or 3, but we still got 3 guns at home. And I don't think that has changed, although buybacks have gotten smarter. You don't get any, whatever the reward is, they're now tiered. You don't get much if you bring in an old broken gun. Sometimes you won't even take it. Bring in a new AK and you get quite the gift card. You get the idea. But the prevalence problem is still there. Where buybacks, I think, have a real chance is if they serve as an initial point of mobilization, because they are concrete. There's something a community can do. There is tangible evidence filling up the dumpster of there are fewer guns in our community, etc. If the community then says, okay, we've taken care of the gun violence problem and walks away, nothing has been accomplished. If from the beginning it's understood that, okay, today it's the buyback, but what are we going to do next? Then starting with the buyback is fine.
Hello, my name is Jimmy Draper. I am the president and founder of Coalition Against Gun Violence at Berkeley. It's a primarily for undergraduate students here at UC Berkeley, but it's welcome to faculty, graduate students, anyone kind of near or around the university. Additionally, Melanie Amirkawi is over there. She is one of the vice presidents, and so we're really excited to kind of get to work this year. My question today is, acknowledging that up until this point there have been relatively few publications surrounding the issue of gun violence, as we've discussed a lot, how do you think this center's publications and other groups' publications will affect grassroots advocacy and just the general discussion of gun violence across the nation? Because up until this point, a lot of the activism is based on kind of logical arguments and social media and class discussions, but there's less factual evidence in the discussion.
So we are starting from where we are starting. There's no part of this problem about which we know enough. And the same thing happens in clinical medicine. When you have hard evidence, you use it. When you don't have hard evidence, you use expert opinion. When you don't have expert opinion, you cross your fingers and hope you're making the right guess. But for goodness sakes, you don't then walk away and not see what happened, right? All of that. So I want to just clarify something. At Davis, there is, and there has been for quite some time, the Violence Prevention Research Program, which is an organized research effort focusing traditionally on firearm violence. With Magda's arrival a year and a half ago, we have broadened our scope. Hannah Lacour is in the room, and Rose Kagawa is in the room. They are or will soon work for us, with us, and are broadening our scope still further, and life is really cool in Sacramento. By the way, second announcement, we're recruiting. And if you are interested in an analyst position involved in that randomized trial that I was talking about, come see me. I've got the job posting number. I've forgotten it. But we're recruiting, and we're going to be recruiting a lot more because of the other thing I want to say. On top of VPRP, as we call it, the state legislature, recognizing much of what's been talked about today as a problem, the lack of evidence and so on, has appropriated $5 million to create a new California Firearm Violence Research Center. It's the only one of its kind. It's the only such center with public funding in the country. It is going to be headquartered at UC Davis because at the moment we're the largest concentration of expertise in the UC system. I hope there will come a time when I can't say that. Can I out you? Thank you. Jen Ahern has just agreed to be outed. Jen is the Berkeley campus lead. We'll make up the term on the fly here for this. It's going to be headquartered at Davis. Several other campuses are going to be involved. All of this is still in the planning stage. Janet Napolitano has not said yes to all this, but I think she will, and we will be up and running. Back to your question. We are going to be scientists, first, last, and always. This is advocates in the room understand this. I, as an advocate, when I do that, understand it. The science has got to be science. It cannot start from a policy agenda. It can start with a policy relevant question, but it can't start with an agenda. And the evidence is what the evidence turns out to be. And this center will publish, just as VPRP has done historically, we will publish the evidence, whatever it is, regardless of whose policy agenda is upset by it. I take it as a matter of, this is something that's close to home for me. I take it as a matter of great personal pride that I have enemies at both extremes of the advocacy spectrum, which tells me I've probably been doing just about the right thing. Okay, sorry.
I think, speaking as somebody who's relatively new to this field, somebody who just started a few years ago looking at this topic, it's a very different world now than it was, I think, 30 years ago. When I was starting out doing research in epidemiology, I was told, your interest is on violence. That's very nice, but there's no NIH funding on violence, so go focus on something else, focus on drugs, focus on mental illness. That's not the case anymore, right? Now there's funding from NIH to focus on firearm violence, to focus on the links between violence and other problems. And I think that's got to have a big impact in terms of the national debate. Just like the analysis that I showed about, you know, the causal link between gun availability and violence. That was a very basic question that's just been answered. There's so much more that we can answer in terms of the causes of violence, in terms of the effectiveness of different legislation on violence, not only in the United States but abroad. So I hope that with the center we can actually start to change the conversation with data, not only, again, for the US, but for other countries in the Americas and in other places as well.
Since you've done an advertisement or two, I'm going to throw one in there as well. A couple of years ago, Janet Napolitano started an initiative that she calls UC Mexico. Yeah. And that initiative is trying to link the 10 campuses of UC with comparable institutions in Mexico in the areas of the environment, education, energy, art and culture, and health. And one of the 5 priority areas that the health group has identified is violence and extra domestic violence. There's been more collaboration historically on domestic violence between UC and Mexican institutions. And in its initial iteration, it did not focus on gun violence in particular. It focused on community-level violence linked to a large degree with the drug situation. There's a saying in Mexico that is, Pobre México, tan lejos de Dios, tan cerca de los Estados Unidos, which is poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States. In this case, the U.S. buys the drugs that Mexico either produces or transports through Mexico and exports the guns back to Mexico. So one of the things that came up at our last meeting with the president was she said, what about a focus on gun violence, given the permissive atmosphere in this country compared to where we have been in the past? As you guys both know, she was the Secretary of Homeland Security. And I think there's an opportunity here for collaboration with our southern neighbor on this particular issue, because certainly gun violence, as you pointed out, is an even bigger problem in Mexico than it is in the United States right now. Although what is obscured by any map like that is that it's as heterogeneous within Mexico as it is anywhere else. I mean, Mérida is much safer than where we're standing right now, and Mexico City is safer than Los Angeles from a gun violence perspective, but of course there are other parts of the countries that are much, much worse. Well, unless somebody else wants to raise their hand, I think there's wine and cheese waiting for us outside. So I want to make a big, big thanks to our co-sponsors first, but most importantly to our speakers.